April 15, 1912. 2 miles beneath the glass calm surface of the North Atlantic, a giant comes to rest in total darkness. She was the pinnacle of human industry, a 4-stacker fortress of steel deemed invincible by the brightest minds of the Edwardian age. But the unsinkable was never a fact. It was a dare. And on one moonless night, the ocean finally accepted the challenge. This is the true story of the Titanic, from its birth in fire to its eternal silence. The ambition of iron. It was the dawn of the 20th century, an era defined by a fierce industrial pride. The British Empire and its rivals were locked in a feverish race to dominate the seas, not just with naval might, but through the prestige of the transatlantic crossing. This was the age of the gilded class, where billionaires like Astor, Guggenheim, and Strauss demanded a level of opulence that the world had never seen before. In this climate, a ship wasn't just a vehicle. It was a statement of national and corporate supremacy. The story truly begins with a quiet dinner in London's Belgravia in 1907. 2 men, J. Bruce Ismay, the ambitious chairman of the White Star Line, and Lord Pirrie, the visionary partner of the Harland and Wolff shipyard, sketched out a plan that would redefine human travel. Their goal wasn't speed. The rival Cunard Line already held the records for velocity with their sleek flyers, the Mauretania and Lusitania. Instead, White Star would dominate through sheer, overwhelming scale and steady comfort. They planned a trio of Olympic-class sisters, the Olympic, the Titanic, and the Gigantic. Construction began in Belfast, Ireland, in March 1909. For 3 years, the Harland and Wolff shipyard became a hive of 15,000 workers. The noise was constant, a rhythmic, deafening thunder of hammer against steel that could be heard across the city. To build a ship 882 feet long required the construction of the world's largest gantry, a massive steel scaffold known as the Arroll Gantry, which dwarfed the Belfast skyline. Thousands of men, known as rivet boys, worked in teams to heat, pass, and hammer 3 million steel rivets into place by hand. It was backbreaking, dangerous work. 8 men died during the construction phase alone, a grim preview of the ship's appetite for life. The Titanic was a masterpiece of Victorian engineering. Her hull was composed of 2,000 steel plates, each an inch thick, designed to withstand the brutal pressures of the North Atlantic. Her engines were the size of houses, 2 massive reciprocating engines and a low-pressure turbine that together produced 50,000 horsepower. When she was finally launched, she weighed over 46,000 tons, moving with a momentum that seemed to command the very tides. But beneath the luxury and the rivets, a dangerous culture of overconfidence was taking root. The engineers believed they had mastered the Atlantic. They believed that steel and steam could conquer any natural force, a belief fueled by the ship's sheer mass. But as the last rivets were hammered home, the focus shifted from how the ship was built to the dangerous myth of why it couldn't fail. The illusion of safety. By the time the Titanic was ready for her sea trials, Unsinkable had evolved from a technical ambition into a cultural gospel. It was a term whispered in the boardrooms of the White Star Line and shouted from the headlines of every major newspaper in London and New York. While the company's official marketing materials were technically more cautious, the public and the press had already made up their minds. To the world in 1912, the Titanic was more than just a ship. She was a fortress of steel, a physical manifestation of man's final victory over the elements. This sense of invincibility was rooted in a very specific piece of engineering: the 16 watertight compartments. These compartments were the pride of the Harland and Wolff engineers. The hull was divided by 15 transverse bulkheads, creating 16 separate sections. These were equipped with massive, electrically operated steel doors that could be dropped instantly with a single switch from the bridge. The logic was supposedly foolproof. The Titanic could stay afloat even if any 2 of these compartments were completely flooded. In a worst-case scenario, such as a direct head-on collision, she could even survive with the first 4 forward compartments breached. The engineers calculated that the ship was so buoyant that it would take a catastrophe of impossible proportions to actually drag her down. In the minds of the crew, this rendered the possibility of a total disaster a relic of the past. However, this profound confidence led to a series of decisions that would prove fatal. The most glaring of these was the choice regarding the lifeboats. When the Titanic was first designed, her builders at Harland and Wolff had actually planned for 48 lifeboats, a number that would have provided a seat for every soul on board. But during the development process, this number was slashed. J. Bruce Ismay and the designers argued that a cluttered deck would ruin the aesthetic experience for the first-class passengers, obstructing their views of the horizon and making the ship feel crowded. They ultimately settled on just 20 boats. This wasn't illegal. Maritime law at the time was woefully outdated, basing lifeboat requirements on a ship's tonnage rather than its passenger capacity. The Titanic was legally required to carry boats for only 962 people. By carrying 20, they were actually exceeding the law. They weren't preparing for a sinking. They were preparing for a minor accident, where the Titanic would act as a lifeboat for another ship. The interior of the ship only reinforced this illusion of permanence. For the wealthy elite, the Titanic was a floating palace. It featured a Parisian cafe with real ivy climbing the walls, a saltwater swimming pool, a Turkish bath, and the legendary Grand Staircase, crowned by an exquisite glass dome that flooded the center of the ship with light. The vibration of the engines was so dampened that passengers often forgot they were moving at all. Even the immigrants in third class, many of whom were fleeing poverty in Europe, found the Titanic's accommodations to be a revelation. For many of them, it was the first time they had ever slept in a bed with clean white linens or had access to indoor plumbing. Yet as the ship prepared for its maiden voyage, there were subtle, overlooked warnings. During the sea trials, a coal fire was discovered in bunker number 6. It was a smoldering, deep-seated fire that burned for days, requiring stokers to frantically move coal to the engines just to reach the source. Some historians now argue that the intense heat of this fire may have weakened the steel of a nearby bulkhead, potentially playing a role in the ship's eventual failure. But in the spring of 1912, these were seen as minor inconveniences. The schedule was set, the tickets were sold, and the giant was ready to claim her crown. On April 10th, she finally met the ocean. 4 days later, that same ocean would begin to claw its way inside. The anatomy of a collision. The voyage began with a display of the Titanic's terrifying physical power. As she departed Southampton, the sheer volume of water displaced by her massive hull created a suction so strong it snapped the mooring lines of the docked SS City of New York. The smaller ship began to drift helplessly toward the Titanic's side, and only the quick thinking of a nearby tugboat prevented a collision on day 1. To the superstitious, it was an omen. To the White Star Line, it was simply proof that they had built something larger than the harbor itself could comfortably hold. After brief stops in Cherbourg, France, and Queenstown, Ireland, the Titanic turned her bow toward the open Atlantic, beginning the long stretch toward New York. For the first few days, the crossing was a triumph. The sea was calm, the engines were humming at a steady 22 knots, and the passengers were enjoying the pinnacle of Edwardian luxury. However, beneath this serene surface, the wireless room was becoming a center of growing concern. On Sunday, April 14th, the Titanic received 6 separate warnings about growlers and massive ice fields directly in her path. The Baltic, the Koronia, and the Mesaba all sent urgent messages describing icebergs at specific coordinates. Some of these reached Captain Edward Smith, who acknowledged them and ordered the ship's course shifted slightly further south, but he did not slow down. In the maritime culture of 1912, speed was a matter of prestige, and a late arrival was considered a failure of seamanship. The prevailing belief was that on a clear night, any ice large enough to damage a ship would be seen in plenty of time to steer around it. But the night of April 14th was anything but normal. As the sun set, the temperature plummeted toward freezing. The sea became like glass, unnervingly flat and still. This lack of movement was a hidden death sentence. Normally, waves breaking against the base of an iceberg create a white fringe of foam that can be seen for miles. On this night, there were no waves. Furthermore, the two lookouts in the Crow's Nest, Frederick Fleet and Reginald Lee, were scanning the horizon with the naked eye. Due to a crew reorganization in Southampton, the locker containing the binoculars had been locked, and the key was on shore. They were essentially flying blind through a minefield of ice. At 11:40 p.m., the air suddenly turned even colder. Out of the darkness, a black mass appeared, darker than the night sky itself. It was the iceberg. Fleet rang the warning bell 3 times and shouted into the bridge telephone, "Iceberg, right ahead." First Officer William Murdoch, who was in charge of the bridge, had only seconds to react. He gave the order, hard a starboard, and signaled the engine room to stop and reverse. It was a textbook maneuver, but at 46,000 tons, the Titanic was too heavy to pivot on a dime. The ship didn't hit the iceberg head-on. Instead, it performed a slow, agonizing, glancing blow along the starboard side. Above deck, the impact was so light that some passengers didn't even wake up. On the upper decks, chunks of ice fell onto the well deck, and some passengers jokingly began a game of football with the frozen fragments. But below the waterline, it was a massacre. The jagged underwater spur of the iceberg hadn't cut the ship like a knife. It had buckled the steel plates, popping the rivets and opening a series of narrow gashes. The iceberg had breached the first 5 watertight compartments. This was the one scenario the ship could not survive. Thomas Andrews, the ship's builder, was summoned to the bridge to inspect the damage. He knew the ship's blueprints better than anyone. He watched the water rising in the mailroom and the squash court, and he did the math. The weight of the water in the first 5 compartments would pull the bow down so low that the water would eventually spill over the top of the bulkheads into the 6th compartment, then the 7th, like an ice cube tray being filled. "She is a mathematical certainty to sink," he told the captain. The giant was dying, and she had less than 2 hours left to live. As the stern vanished beneath the freezing black, the world above was changed forever, leaving behind a graveyard and a hard-learned lesson in pride. Hell in the freezing water. The final moments of the Titanic were a harrowing study in the collapse of Edwardian order. As the bow dipped lower, the terrifying reality of the lifeboat shortage finally pierced through the ship's atmosphere of calm luxury. Panic began to ripple from the lower decks upward. The women and children first protocol was enforced with varying degrees of desperation. On the port side, Second Officer Lightoller allowed only women and children into the boats, while on the starboard side, First Officer Murdoch allowed men to fill the remaining seats. This inconsistency, combined with the general disbelief that the ship could actually disappear, led to many of the early boats being lowered half-empty, wasting precious seats that would never be recovered. Below decks, the scene was far more grim. The third-class passengers, many of whom did not speak English, found themselves navigating a labyrinth of flooding corridors and locked gates. By the time many reached the boat deck, the majority of the lifeboats were already gone. Meanwhile, the ship's band, led by Wallace Hartley, continued to play on the deck. It was a final, gallant attempt to maintain a facade of civilization as the world tilted at a 45-degree angle. They played until the very end, their music eventually drowned out by the roar of the sea and the groaning of stressed steel. At 2:17 a.m., the Titanic's elegant silhouette underwent a violent transformation. The lights, which had flickered with a persistent, eerie glow, finally went out, plunging the scene into total darkness. With a sound described by survivors as a thunderous roar, the ship broke in two between the third and fourth funnels. The bow section immediately began its 2-mile plunge to the ocean floor. The stern, momentarily righting itself, bobbed like a cork before the weight of the engines dragged it upward into a vertical position. For a few moments, it stood silhouetted against the stars, a black tombstone in the middle of the Atlantic, before silently sliding beneath the waves at 2:20 a.m. The aftermath was a silent, freezing graveyard. 1,500 people were left in the 28-degree water a temperature so cold that it causes the heart to stop within minutes. Those in the lifeboats, floating just a few hundred yards away, listened to the terrible chorus of screams that slowly faded into a deafening silence. When the RMS Carpathia arrived 2 hours later, they found only 705 survivors. The unsinkable giant had vanished, taking with it the lives of millionaires and penniless immigrants alike, proving that the ocean has no regard for social standing. The disaster marked the end of the Gilded Age's blind faith in technological progress. For 73 years, the ship lay lost in the darkness until Robert Ballard's 1985 expedition located the wreckage 12,500 feet down. Today, she is a protected maritime memorial, though she is slowly being reclaimed by the Earth. Iron-eating bacteria, known as Halomonas titanici, are consuming the steel, creating rusticles that hang like icicles from the hull. Experts believe that within the next few decades, the Titanic will collapse entirely, leaving only a rust stain on the seabed. Yet even when the steel is gone, the story will endure, a permanent reminder of the night that human pride met the cold, indifferent reality of the Atlantic. Would you have survived it if you were in the ship? Leave your comments below and hit that subscribe button for more.